Right. So, what we discussed in the last session about business requirements document, as I mentioned you, business requirements document is the one which will be used to prepare business requirements. Yesterday, I have shown you that, like mentioning about the business problem, right? So, business objectives, goals, followed by critical success factors, whatever as is in to be system, right? So, what are the difference between as is and to be is called gap analysis. All that we have discussed under the business requirements document. So business requirement document majorly focusing on business related functionalities of the application, completely prepared by the business analyst team, usually the one which I was explained earlier. Now there is another document which is called SRS, right, which stands for software requirement specification. Means whatever the project we are working on in reference to that particular project, whatever the hardware, software, which operating system, right? So what are the hardware and software quality attributes we want to mention? All these things will be mentioned under the software requirement specification, because the major role of a business analyst is to identify the business requirements, but end of the day, these business requirements or the business solutions must be translated into a technical solution. Then only development will be taken place. So translating business functionalities towards the technical side, where we need to mention over the technicalities of the project, means which operating system are we using, right? So what hardware, software, right? All these things. Normally, this will be prepared by the technical team, not by the BA. Underline this point, because software requirement specification is a document completely give us a clarity over the technology or technicalities of the project. Either it can be hardware, software, operating system, all that. But it is essentially important for us to understand, because being a BA, why are we learning about SRS document? Because we need to understand for what purpose software requirement specification we are preparing and what are all the elements which are included in it. Okay, that's where the reason why I'm explaining this to you. And as I mentioned earlier also, some organizations, yesterday I mentioned, if you remember, whatever the functional and non-functional requirements we are developing, some organizations will add those functional and non-functional requirements in the SRS document. And some people will mention it as separate, right? So these are the major understandings. Now here we need to mention the project here, right? So project name. So our project name is called Ekite, right? So which is a Ekite, which is a cloud-based POS, right? So this is what generally, right? So so this is where generally the cloud-based Ekite is what the project name, which is a cloud-based POS system, right? So this is what generally software requirement specification stands for. This is the first of its kind we are doing. For example, hence it is version 1.0, because whenever we prepare the document, so we have to mention the version also, right? Which version are we working on, right? So now it is 1.0. Maybe in future it may go to 2 even, right? So after that, so on, right? So next, that's where generally we need to mention the other details, right? So organization, date created, right, etc., right? So this is all information we have to mention under the software requirement specifications. Now this is where generally table of content. So what are all included in the documentation? So table of content we have to prepare, because templates will be there, right? So templates we get. Next is revision history, means document revision history we call it as we all know, we discussed earlier also. Revision history is something essentially important, because whatever the changes are we making in the existing application, where we made the changes, how, so what changes and who has proposed those changes, everything information has to be updated. So for this reason, revision history is one thing which is essentially important. Reason of changes, what and for what purpose changes we have made, right? Either it can be minor or major changes. All this information will be comes under the revision history. So we don't prepare this in the beginning of the document. Once the document submitted to the technical team, in future, if there are any changes happens in the existing document, to identify that this revision history is being used. So first of its kind, we don't do it. Over a period of time, we do that if there is anything. So after that, here we need to write down the purpose, right? So as you already know, yesterday even in the business requirements documents, also I have told you that because we need to identify the uh, project, right? What exactly the project is all about, right? So ours is a cloud-based point of sale system, for example, right? So ours is a kite project, right? So a kite cloud-based point of sale system, right? So cloud-based point of sale system is our project, right? So what are all the software requirements? We need to understand about the purpose of writing this document here. This is where generally 1.1, because documentation, when we write, it will be categorized into 1, 2, 3, 4, so on. 1, again 1.1. In that 1.1, if you have any subheadings, we have 1.1.1, 1.1.2, right? That's how generally it goes. So this is a documentation standard we follow, right? So this is where generally purpose stands for. So after the purpose, document conventions means how are we going to, is there any standards are we following when we are preparing the documentation? Because I must tell you one thing, organization to organization, the kind of customer we belongs to. So whatever the standards, policies and procedures do we follow will vary. It will not be the same for all the cases. Some organizations, let's say that CMM level organization, your customer is a CMM level organization. There is a documentation standard which normally they expect, which has to be followed by us, right? So because we need to mention about the priorities of high level requirements, right? So at the same time, detailing of requirements, sometimes some customer may expect you to write the requirements in detail sometimes, right? So each and every statement they want us to write it, followed by what sort of priority that particular requirement stands for, right? So all these things we need to mention. So this is where generally document convention stands for. Next 1.3, of course, this is intended audience reading sessions, how to read and all, etc. It's not, leave it. Next, project scope. Whatever the project scope we have identified earlier, because I have already given some assignments to you earlier. When I started my session in between, I have given you. So you need to understand and you need to write business objectives, goals, scope of the project. The same thing will be mentioned in BRD document. At the same time, that will be replicated even in this software requirement specification also. So this information, 1, 2, 3, 4, these are the informations which you have to write on your own, right? So there is nothing there to copy from there somewhere outside and keep it. We need to write based on the observations and findings what we have. This is required, right? So this is needed. Next 1.5 is for references, because any document we prepare, there will be references will be there. I must tell you about the references. References is not something to type. I think people who are belongs to even IT or non-IT, I think few people uh, might be might have worked on some thesis or earlier maybe. I'm not sure, projects and all. There are some standards in the Word document. There are some options which are available in Word document which can be used in reference to the references part. Let's say, for example, I'm working on the article. Let me explain this way. Just put this exam project aside for 2 minutes. Let's say, for example, I'm preparing an article on some XYZ topic. Okay. So whenever I prepare an article, what will happen? Whatever the required information I want to mention on that particular article, everything may not be my own words. Sometimes I'll be taking some references, let's say that abbreviation of so and so definition. Let's say, for example, conflict management styles. Let's say I'm working on that. So there is some definition which was given by some person. conflict management styles, what it was. Someone has given some definition, for example, which I want to quote. I want to quote in my document. That's not mine, but I want to quote what was the definition given by some X person. So I want to mention that. So whenever we mention, there is a documentation standard we follow from where this information we have gathered. When we prepare documentation, there is a standard procedure we follow. Even whenever you read books, if you remember, after the last pages of the books, if you see, there are references, they'll be there. So they'll mention that these are the reference articles or the technical white papers or the books we have referred. And this is that's the reason why this book has been published, right? So 100% is not my own. There are some other influences which I have taken into consideration, right? References. So in the same manner, whenever we are working on the project, so there are some informations we will be gathering by interacting with the customer. Through observation, we'll get to know many things. At the same time, whenever we are going through some documents or technical white papers, or else by going through some websites or reference pages or something, we get some information. So from where we got this information, we have to mention under the references. So for that, here you can see there is an option called reference. You can see over here, right? So there is an option called reference. In this reference, you can see insert citation. Let's say, for example, in this insert citation, add new source. For example, let's say, for example, point of sale system, right? So you want to know the introduction about what is point of sale system. Let us assume, for example, you have copied it from some source. What was that? For example, you may copied that information maybe from some book, or that can be from some book section, or that you may copy it in from a journal article or article periodical, etc., right? So from where you have copied that information we need to update, because there are different sources you can see here. Everything will be there. Next, after that, for example, if you have taken this from the book, right? So who is an author, right? So what was the title of the book, when it was published, right? So publisher name, city details, all that, and we click on OK. So whenever we have updated, so what will happen? Whatever the insert citations we have, because while we are doing through the documentation, every time, let's say that I have taken some introduction. So immediately what I do, I go to insert citation and I'll give the references there. So whatever the references I have mentioned, everything will be updated in this bibliography. Here it will be updated, right? So here it will be updated. Once everything was updated, automatically, simply if I can click on insert bibliography, you can see here, this is how generally this bibliography, whatever the references you have taken, everything will be published automatically. So this is a standard which normally we follow. But here you could ask me one thing, Raj, is it really people who are following means? It's a doubt, right? So I don't say that people follow. But when you are preparing some documentation, it is always important for you to some principles. To what extent people are following, it is different from one person to another, right? I cannot judge on it, I cannot comment it, because it takes time even, because updating all these, right? So takes time. Due to their professional constraints, they may not have that much time to update all these. There could be other reasons even. So, but when it comes to the references, what is that I'm trying to say? References is not something that we type. References is what something we have to update in the insert citations, where insert bibliography, you will be getting all the information. So that's what I want to say that. Next, product perspective, 2.1. 2.1 about the product perspective, which whatever the product are we working on. So we need to mention about the perspective of the product, because the same thing you can see even in BRD document, which I have given yesterday, right? So product perspective was there. The same manner, we need to write on our own. Next, here we need to mention the product features, right? So what are the different features for the product? Let me give you, for example, ours is point of sale system. Features of point of sale system. Ours is a cloud-based POS, right? Ours is a cloud-based point of sale system. This is about cloud-based POS system, right? So these are the features. What was that? One is CRM and loyalty. Okay. Next, franchise and multi-location. This can be of one feature. Next, hardware and cash register. Next, inventory management system. Next was loss prevention. It can be payments. It can be reporting and analytics. It can be software. It can be 24/7 support. Yeah, enough, right? So these are the features for your product. Whatever the product are we developing, these are the features of the product. So CRM loyalty, franchise multi-location, hardware and cash register, inventory management, etc., etc. These are the features of the product. Now, after that, user classes and characteristics. User classes and characteristics means who are users here, because in the BRD document, if you remember, I have mentioned what is that. For example, biller. Second, inventory inventory professional, or else HR team. Next to store manager. Okay. Right. So what biller do? Biller using a kite application or a product, right? Whatever it can be. I'm just writing, right? Biller perform billing for the product. So of course, there is a detailed description we have to write. So whatever the way you can write. So it's not in one sentence, at least one or two lines we have to write. Next, inventory professional, right? So inventory professional using this application to check the inventory which was sold on daily basis. Okay. HRT maybe wants to access the access of the employee followed by their timings, etc. Okay, timings, etc. Right. So they want this. Next, store manager wants to access this application to generate reports for business performance and taking decisions. Okay, taking decisions. This is where generally user means for what how this product is being used by the users. User classes and characteristics means how they are going to use. The detailed one we have to write. Because, for example, I've just written in a shorter format, right? So you need to write the detail, right? Customer has to log in first, right? So he has to check, he has to scan all the products, so and so, biller, sorry, right? So biller has to scan all the products. So where he has to mention all the costs there, right? Final formula. Right? That's how generally the detailed part we need to write it. So this is where generally user classes and characteristics stands for. Next is operating environment. Which operating system are we using? Because operating systems can be anything, right? Let's say, for example, it can be Windows, right? So it can be Unix flavors like Linux and Solaris, right? So different operating systems. Because ours is a cloud-based point of sale system, whichever operating system or the platform services we are taking, because whenever we are talking about cloud services, generally cloud services will be categorized into three different parts. Let me write down here. I think last time I told you that. So cloud services, we opt based on the following services, following ones. Normally, cloud services will be three types. One is IaaS, PaaS, SaaS. IaaS stands for infrastructure as a service. Let's say, for example, you want to use infrastructure of Windows Azure platform, right? We want some infrastructure to be used, storage, networking, etc. Right? So we can opt for that service. Platform as a service. Platform means what is meant by platform. For example, you are constructing a building. Right. So if you want to construct a building, what is that we required? We required a platform, right? So we requirement a basement where we required a platform which must be built properly. Then only the construction of the building will be so strong. Otherwise, due to the natural calamities, it may get got damaged. This is where generally platform stands for. Means if you want to develop any application, there is a platform is required. So platform services can also opt. We can opt platform services also. Next, software services means if you want to develop an application, there is a software is required. Even software services can also be opted by us. So depends on the kind of services what we have taken. Either it can be AWS, it can be PaaS, or it can be SaaS. Whatever services we opt, based on that billing will be taken place. That's how generally this cloud services and all everything is being used by us. So when we are talking about, because ours is a cloud-based point of sale system, in reference to that, I am saying all this. If it's not a cloud-based application, assume that it's an on-premise application where we are storing application on-premise. So then we don't require all that. We don't need all these services. So we can simply move on to the next level. But if it's a cloud service provider, it depends on the kind of services we have taken from Windows Azure. Either if you're taking infrastructure as a services, then this operating environment, right? So it can be networking, right? So all these things comes into picture. If it's a platform, operating environment comes. Software means which software, right? Which programming language are we going to use, right? All these things comes under picture here. This is where generally these operating environment and all everything will come into existence. Next, design and implementation constraints. Design and implementation constraints means when you want to design an application, there are some standards we have to follow. At the same time, when we want to implement a project, there are some implementation constraint it can be, because this is where generally network security come into picture, because there are different architects. If you remember in the beginning days when I explained you about the business architecture, I told you about architects, different type of architects we have. Let me explain. Let me show that to you so that you get some idea. In the beginning, I have told you that. I'm not sure whether you remember it or not. Yeah, here you can see, right? So there are different architects, as I told you, right? Network architects, right? So security architects, cloud architects, different architects will be there. So when we are working on this design and implementation constraints, implementation of the project, which is something even connecting to the security considerations also, because different communication protocols we use, security considerations, design conventions, at the same time programming standards, all that, right? So all these things are important. So architects' roles are so important. The reason why I told you in the beginning of the session, this document is not something prepared by the business analyst directly, okay? Because any little information we are supporting, we'll do it. But end of the day, technical people involvement is required. Technical people has to be involved in this, because we don't do that. So, so for example, there is a network architect, right? So network architect developing networking for the project. Whatever the network architecture, they have to prepare it. Security architect builds security for the application in order to control from the malware practices by maybe from different ways. So cloud architect will take care of the cloud application. If it's a cloud application, cloud architect come into picture. So this is where and how usually when we are working on the application, whenever we are preparing any documentation, especially in context to software and all. So design and implementation constraints where multiple stakeholders will be involved. It's not something like developers or testers, right? So I don't say that. To prepare this document, of course, some documentation standards people have to follow. Some documentation techniques people should be aware of. That is anyway, it is needed, it is required. So I don't deny that fact. So apart from that, what else is required? Not only this, we should be able in a position to understand what exactly this design and implementation constraints stands for and for what purposes are we going to do and how are we performing it. Because multiple stakeholders, right? So it can be network security, architects may be involved in it. If it's a cloud application and all, cloud level security, networking and all will be as separate, right? So because that structure architecture is separate, right? So whatever the protocols are we going to use, servers, firewalls, right? So these are all cloud environment, right? So because this is not on-premise. If it's an on-premise application, then that is different. Okay, that approach is different. That performance is when we are working on the application will be quite different. This is where generally this design and implementation constraints will be. So these constraints, as I told you, right? So it can be regulatory policies also. Let's say when we are working on the application, excuse me. Right. So whenever we are working on the regulatory policies, it is always important for us to understand what policies and procedures do we require to follow. So these policies and procedures again depends on the organization we work with. So they may have different constraints in regard to the data security. Let's say for data breaching, not to eradicate data breaching and all. Let's say especially banking, finance, healthcare. So these sort of projects required more data to be secure, right? Because customers uses their cards, customer use their valid details, all that. So those details has to be secure. At the same time, because if that was not secure, what will happen? Even the application was good. If it is as far as security is concerned, assume that the design level standards when we are working, if there is weak, automatically there is a possibility as of breakage of that security orbit, right? So there are possibilities. So in order to eradicate that, generally 2.5, which is design and implementation constraints, what could be the possible constraints? This is in interacting with even client team also we do, because we need to interact with the client team. So based on the interaction, what is that we had with the client team, we come to know what could be the design and implementation constraints. Everything will be known to us well in advance. This is where generally design and implementation constraints, all these things are comes into picture. Next one about user documentation. 2.6 about user documentation means if you want to write documentation, I'll give you an example to you. Let's say documentation, because documentation matlab, it means because for example, how point of sale system, cloud-based POS system. So any new user might be possible to use this application in future at the employer level. So those people may or may not have an awareness about what features and how those features has to work and how it is can be used effectively. So it is always important for us that we'll provide some help document. So if you see here, for example, if you have taken Word document here, okay. So whenever you are going for Word document, so there will be some help which will be available, right? So if you want to take any help, means for example, if there is any new options which are available, if you want to take any help and all everything, so those references we can take it. Whatever the little references we want, here, right? So here F1. Here you can see word help, right? So for example, is it in offline? Yes, sir. Right. So here you can see, for example, installing or maybe for reading document, for example, right? So article. So this will be in HTML format. So how to read it up, mark up a document. So these are the instructions. This is how it gives. For example, I'm using Word document. I am not completely aware of, see, nobody is completely perfect in what we use, right? So to an extent possible, based on our limits, based on our requirement, only we use it. We are not proficient in every area, right? Let's say that in Word, there are a lot of options are available. Due to the interest, due to the requirement, only we use it. So what we do here is in help. So based on the help and all, whatever the requirement I want, I can see, I can read it, I can read it. Based on that, I can operate this application, because Microsoft Word, this Word document is also an application, right? This is also an application like cloud-based POI system. It's also an application. So we are the users. Whoever is using that application are called as users here. So user documentation. So user documentation and all everything will be in a format of HTML, not in the Word document. Because Word document format, if there is any version of operating system changes, automatically that will be converted. So that normally we don't do that. User documentation will be in a format of HTML formats and all everything we use. So that we need to be updated. And this is how generally help will be looks like. Just now I told you. For every project, there will be some help. Because whenever you are working on some software, right? So everywhere there is help. API documentation will be there where you have to see and read. But the major problem is that we don't get time and we don't show interest to read all the documentation. That was the problem. So if you have that inculcating a habit of reading some documents and API, many of the things we can get some idea. But end of the day, that patience is required. Okay. Anyway, let's not get into that, right? So this is where generally user documentation stands for. What standards, procedures do we require to follow? So all these things are comes under the user documentation. Next, 2.7 about assumptions and dependencies. What are the different assumptions and dependencies? If you remember, assumptions and dependencies in the BRD document I have shown you. I have told you. I think you got an idea, right? So assumptions and dependencies. Yesterday I have written some points and I have shown you in the BRD document. Last session video you can go through so that you get some idea if you have not identified, right? So assumptions and dependencies, hence I am not writing again, right? So dependencies, it can be a dependency like even dependency also I have written. For example, inventory management system is a dependency. Why? Because if inventory management system records were not updated properly, so even though in point of sale system you are accessing, the information won't be as accurate as it requires. Next, at the same time, dependency with the payroll management system. Employees are the people who do the billing. So they have to update all the records there properly. Then only the dependencies will exist. Right. So this is where generally dependency. These are all we call it. We also call it as software quality attributes. That I'll explain it later. Right, so this is where generally 2.7, which is called assumptions and dependencies, all that. Okay, this is where. So in the BRD document, you can go through. The same thing will also be applied here. Because there will be some similarities, there will be some similar points will also be covered here. Okay, please keep that in account. Next, the third one about system features. You know that last time I have told you, for example, sometime back I have told you, right? So for example, these are the features. For example, the feature called inventory management. Okay, inventory management. If you want to enable this feature, what is required? There is a functionality of printing labels and tags we have to do. Means for every product there will be a barcode, right? Every product there will be a barcode. So barcode depends on the classification of the products. What is that we have graded? So we have to mention the labels in form of a barcode in form of labels. And tags, everything we have to mention. This is functionality 1. This is F1. Okay, functionality 1. Right? So for example, if you want to import product, how to do it? Functionality 2. So consolidating the product database. This is functionality 3. Right? Multiple product codes providing. This is functionality 4. These are the functionalities which belongs to inventory management system feature, because system feature is nothing but inventory management. Functionalities, these are the functionalities F1, F2, F3, F4. These are the functionalities. So how to develop these functionalities, how to write business logic for this, developers will write it. But whether these functionalities, what functionalities to write and all, this meeting is going to be ended soon. Please join again. Okay. Please join again.